7. The next week, I received information better than any Christmas gift. I was sitting at home listening to the radio when I heard a wonderful announcement. The National Examinations Board has released the results of this year's Standard 8 exams, the announcer said. If you'd like to check your score, the board asks you to visit the institution where you sat for the test. My scores, I said to my mother. My scores are ready. I raced down the trail toward Wimby Primary, leaping over the puddles and pits in the trail, feeling such confidence that my head began swimming with the great possibilities. Which boarding school would I be going to? Chayamba? Kasungu? Since I decided I wanted to be a scientist, not just any scientist, but a great one, I knew those two schools had the best teachers, along with libraries and laboratories and everything I needed to achieve that dream. I didn't care which one I was chosen for. Wherever those chaps needed me, I'd happily go. The list was posted on the wall outside the administration building. A few other students were also there. I pushed through them, a busy, determined man. The various schools were posted with students' names listed below. I quickly found Kasungu and scanned the names beneath it. Nothing. Moving toward Chayamba, my fingers slid over the names Kalambo, Kalimbu, then Makalani. Wait a minute, I thought. There must be some mistake. I scanned the lists again, but my name wasn't there. Here you are, Kamkwamba, said the boy behind me. His name was Michael, one of the top students. You're going to Kachokolo. Sure enough, my name was beneath Kachokolo Secondary School, possibly the worst one in the district. Kachokolo was a community school or a village school and not a top priority when the government sent their funding. How could this be, I thought. The exam grades were posted next on the next board. Finding my name, I soon discovered why. Mathematics, C. Primary science, C. English, C. Chichewa, B. Social studies, D. My heart sank. I imagined walking the long road to Chacocolo, which was about 5 kilometers away. The school was near one of the big tobacco estates, and that road was usually filled with mud and insects. A big dam was nearby, and sometimes Gilbert, Jeffrey, and I went fishing there. Congratulations, said Michael, laughing. You've been chosen to go to the dam school. If anything, you'll become a great fisherman. In 2 years, I can take my junior certification exam, I answered, thinking aloud. Then I can transfer to a better school. You'll see me soon in Kasungu. Don't laugh at me now. Good luck, he said, laughing anyway. That's what I would do, I decided. I'd study and become the best student at this village school. Then I'd take my JCE exam and impress them all. At Kasungu and Chayamba, they'd be on their knees begging me. In the meantime, there was one good thing about going to Kachokolo. Gilbert had also been assigned there. His grades had also stunk. I thought about the two of us walking to school together, and that made me feel more excited. I had 2 weeks to prepare. The new year arrived with daily rains that watered our maize seedlings and encouraged them to grow. By now, their stalks were deep green and reached my father's shins. The rains had also allowed us to transport our tobacco plants from the dambo to the fields, where the seedlings were now growing strong. The rains also brought the forests alive, caused the flowers to bloom, and the bushes to blossom. Everywhere you went, the land was rich and green, and the air smelled sweet and fragrant. It was a spectacular joke, of course, because nothing was ready to eat. The rainy season was when the insects bred and hatched their young, when bowflies swarmed the latrines, coming up from the septicole fat and greenish black. Outside, the flies were so thick you couldn't escape them. They collected on your leg and feet when you were standing still, and on your face when you were trying to talk. People were swatting flies everywhere they went. There were also great clouds of mosquitoes carrying malaria and death between their wings. The roaches were also more abundant and bigger than usual. At night, after a heavy rain, the valley was alive with the sound of millions of frogs, some that whooped and gurgled, while the call of others was like giant drops of water falling from heaven. Bloop, bloop, bloop. The rainy season was for mud and insects, a time when only the geckos and spiders got fat. For the people, the rains merely brought further misery to those struggling to survive. Even though no one could afford to pay the Wanganyu to work, they continued to walk the roads with their bundles and hoes, stepping through the mud while the rain soaked them from above. By now, the cost of maize had reached nearly 1,000 kwacha a pail, and the Wanganyu and most everyone else had turned to a strict diet of gaga. Once the gaga began to run low, the traders started mixing it with sawdust. The yellow flakes were somehow concealed in the brown chaff, never revealing themselves until the porridge soured in people's stomachs. Once this was discovered, many gathered around the traders who were still selling it in the market. "I spent all my money only to get a bellyful of sawdust," they shouted. "My children are homesick. This isn't human." They could complain, but with no other money in their pockets, there was little I could do. At home, my mother spent hours each day baking her cakes, mixing the batter and placing the drops into a metal pot, which she then buried in the coals. She did this over and over until she had 100 cakes, which she placed in a large basin covered in cloth. She then filled a pitcher with water and took a few cups so the starving ones could finish filling their stomachs with liquid after eating the cakes. Each evening when my mother came home, we grabbed the basin from her hands, pretending to help her, only to peek under the cloth to see how much flour she'd managed to earn. Most of her customers were still farmers who'd either sold their worldly possessions or else had taken loans from the traders and businessmen, who were now charging 300% interest. Those were the terms, and if you didn't like them, perhaps you could interest them in your dishes or the roof of your house. Most people took the loans, either because they had nothing to sell in the first place or their homes were already empty. With these conditions, the situation in the trading center became more and more intense. People would gather around the traders like Mr. Mangochi and complain, but these complaints rarely came with threats. People had no energy for violence. "This is our food," they'd shout. "Why are you starving us with these prices?" "The farmers in Tanzania are charging us double," Mr. Mangochi would answer, telling the truth. "If I lower my prices, I'll be finished and you'll have nothing tomorrow." One afternoon, my mother arrived at the market as usual, set up her table, and within seconds a mob descended on her stand, shouting and grabbing at her things. "I'll take 2, one woman screamed. "Give me 3, said a man. With this sudden rush and chaos, my mother didn't notice that a few people were snatching cakes from the basin. Others placed an order, but then grabbed what they wanted and fled. One man even sat down next to my mother and said, "I'll take 3. He grabbed 3 cakes from the basin and ate them quickly. "9 kwacha, my mother said. "I don't have any money," he answered. That evening, when my mother came home, her hair was wild and her face drawn and tired. "Mama, you must be exhausted," I said, grabbing the basin to have a peek. It was nearly empty. "They took almost everything," she said. "There won't be much tonight." She was right. That night, we had a very small supper. As the price of maize continued to rise, my parents had to cut back even more on the amount they purchased. This meant that my mother had a smaller number of cakes to sell, which meant our family had less to eat. Our blob of sema began to shrink to 5 mouthfuls, then 4 mouthfuls. "Every time you put sema into your mouth, add some water," my mother instructed. "That way, you trick your stomach." Although most of us kids tried to be conscious of our portions, my sister Rose, who was 7 years old, would grab larger handfuls of sema and stuff them in her mouth before anyone could stop her. "Hey, slow down," shouted Doris, who was 2 years older. "Mama, she's taking bigger pieces." "Maybe you should eat faster," snapped Rose. We were all becoming thin, especially Rose and Meles, the 2 youngest, above Tiamika. They unfortunately took after my mother, small and lithe, so the hunger ate at them more and revealed itself more clearly in their sunken faces. Aisha, Doris, and I were taller like my father, so we had a bit more to lose. Although by then I'd already fashioned a belt from a long cloth to keep my trousers up, I had to get more creative as the weeks went on. My parents never scolded Rose for taking more than her share, but Doris soon reached her breaking point. Over the past weeks, she'd become paranoid, fearing she wouldn't get any food at supper and my parents wouldn't help her. As a result, meals became moments of stress and anxiety. One evening, as we sat around the bowl of sema, Rose reached out in and pulled off a large piece as usual, but before she could shove it in her mouth, Doris leaped across the basin and began punching her in the face. "Mama!" screamed Rose. "Stop it!" my mother shouted and pulled them apart, a task that seemed to drain the rest of her energy. "Just try to eat and get along. I don't have the strength to deal with you two." That night we went to bed hungry again, the smell of food still strong on our fingers, a smell even water couldn't wash away. As food ran out across Malawi, the government remained silent. Every day we'd listen to the radio for news about the hunger, but nothing was ever said. With the silos of press agriculture empty and their own workers begging for food and not a kernel more of maize at the ad mark, there seemed to be no rescue on the way. Hunger began to breed paranoia, and with it rumors spread. "They sold all of our maize," the people said. "What else have they sold? Nothing is safe in Malawi. What are they trying to hide from us? Convinced the government was collapsing, farmers across the district rushed to banks in Kasungu to withdraw the little savings they had left. One morning in a heavy rain, my father caught a pickup with several others and rode into town. When he arrived, a line stretched out the door and down the street. About 100 men waited all day in the rain with nothing in their stomachs except anger and fear. Once they got inside, the overwhelmed clerks told them to wait even longer. With this, the farmers threatened to riot. "Give us our money now," they shouted. "What are you trying to hide from us?" My father managed to withdraw our family's entire savings, about 1,000 kwacha, and used it to buy another pail of maize, which he milled and sold the next day. We'd eat another week. Despite what was happening, I had something to look forward to in mid-January, when I started classes at Kachikolo Secondary School. For weeks I'd focused on this one day, how I'd finally wear my long trousers and Gilbert and I would walk like big men into our future. Thinking about school, I kept my mind from dwelling on the troubles. Somehow, being hungry at school seemed easier than being hungry at home. The only problem was my uniform. I had a pair of black trousers, but my parents couldn't afford to buy a proper white shirt from the headmaster. Instead, my mother sent me to the used clothing stalls in the trading center. "What difference does it make where it comes from?" she said, "as long as it's white?" Well, I had only 2 shirts in total, and even before school started, I'd been forced to wear my uniform shirt and had gotten it dirty. Then we ran out of soap. We'd managed to buy 1 tablet of cheap Malua lye soap at the first of the month, but it had already vanished. We could wash our bodies with warm water and bangawi bushes, but a white shirt wasn't so easy. One morning, I pulled out the half-tractor tire we used as a washing station and filled it with hot water, letting the shirt soak until the water was cool. I then scrubbed it with bangawi, but it didn't work. Yellow circles remained around the underarms, and my collar was still gray. What could I do? On the first day of class, I met Gilbert on the road so we could walk together. "Gilbert, Bo?" "Bo, sure." "My friend, this is the day we've been waiting for." "It is indeed. Are you ready for the teasing and bullying?" "Yeah. Who do you think will hit us first?" Well, I'd been thinking of a plan. If a Form 3 boy approaches us and he's not quite muscular, we should deal with him straight away. "Oh, that's a good plan." "That will show everyone we can fight." "Exactly. So, who will hit him first?" "I think you should." The 40-minute walk to Kachikolo took us over the hills and across maize fields and past the Dambo Marsh where we once used to hunt. The school sat in a valley surrounded by tobacco estates where I could see giant diesel tractors tilling the soil and the few lucky men with jobs working in the sun. Once at school, we gathered in the yard surrounded by blue gums for our first morning assembly. The headmaster, Mr. W.M. Fury, no relation to the legendary magic fighter, stood up and told us how happy he was to see such bright, promising new faces. "Here, at Kachikolo," he said, "you'll be given the knowledge to help your country and make it proud." We certainly were a fine bunch, all of us eager to learn and squirming with excitement. At that moment, I was certain I was experiencing the greatest day of my life. I couldn't stop smiling. "But just like in any institution of learning," he continued, "this school has rules that must be followed. Every student should be in a proper uniform and be punctual. If not, the punishment shall be swift." When assembly was over, I was walking to my classroom with Gilbert when Mr. Fury tapped me on the shoulder. "What's your name?" he said. "William Trywell Kamkwamba," I said, unable to hide my nerves. "Well, William," he said, "this is not the proper uniform." He must have noticed my underarms. I wanted to run and hide, but Mr. Fury was pointing down at my feet. "Sandals are not allowed," he said. "We require students to wear proper footwear at all times, so please go home and change." I looked down at my flip-flops, which had certainly seen better days. The rubber connecting the sole had broken on one foot, forcing me to carry in my pocket a crochet needle and a bit of rope for emergency repairs. I had no shoes at home. I had to think quickly. "Mr. Headmaster, sir," I said, "I would put on proper footwear, but since I live in Wimby, I must cross 2 streams to get here, and because it's the rainy season, you can imagine how the mud will destroy my good leather shoes. My mother wouldn't have it." He scrunched his eyebrows and considered this. I prayed it would work. "Okay," he said, "it's fine for now, but once the rains are over, I want to see you in proper footwear." My parents had no money for school books either, which cost hundreds of kwacha each. Even in better times, most students couldn't afford these books and were forced to share. At least in primary school, that meant squeezing your bottoms together on your same chair and hoping the other person didn't read faster than you did. But luckily for me, Gilbert had managed to buy his own books and said I could look on, which was good because we read at the same level. At Wimby Primary School, the conditions had been dreadful, with students having to read and study outside under trees because the classrooms were too full. But even inside the classrooms, the roof leaked when it rained. The Standard 3 classroom was missing an entire wall, and the latrines were not only disgusting but dangerous. Termites had eaten away the floor planks, and one afternoon one of my classmates, named Angela, actually fell through. It took hours before anyone heard her screams from the slimy bottom. We never saw her at school again. I'd been hoping for better conditions at secondary school, but no such luck. Once Gilbert and I arrived in our classroom at Cachacolo, our new teacher, Mr. Tembo, told everyone to sit on the floor. It seemed the government had said no money for desks, and from the looks of things, they hadn't sent money for repairs either. A giant hole was in the center of the floor, as if a bomb had exploded. Right away, we began studying history, covering the early civilizations in China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. We learned about written history and oral history and the early forms of writing. We started algebra and math, which I found incredibly difficult. We also started learning a bit of geometry, and this I absolutely loved. In geometry, we learned about angles and degrees, and I remembered builders in the trading center using such terms. One afternoon in geography class, Mr. Tembo pulled out a world map, and we located the continent of Africa. "Can anyone find Malawi?" he asked. "Yeah, here it is." We ran our fingers over our country and marveled at how small a place it was compared to the rest of the earth. To think, my whole life and everything in it had taken place inside this little strip. Looking at it on the map, shaded green with roads zigzagging brown, and lake like a sparkling jewel, you'd never guess that 11 million people lived there. And at that very moment, most of them were slowly starving. Despite what I'd imagined earlier, the hunger was just as painful in class as it was in the fields. Actually, it was worse. Sitting there, my stomach screamed and threatened, twisted in knots, and gave my brain no peace at all. And as I soon found it difficult to pay attention. During the first week of school, enthusiasm among my fellow mates had been high, but only 2 weeks later, the hunger had whittled away at all of us. A gradual silence soon fell over the entire school. At the beginning of term, a dozen hands would shoot up when Mr. Tembo asked, "Okay, any questions?" Now, no one volunteered. Most just wanted to go home to look for food. I noticed faces getting thinner, then some faces disappearing altogether. And with no lotion or soap at home, people's skin became gray and dried as if they were covered in ash. At recess, talk of soccer was replaced by tales of hunger. "I saw people yesterday eating the maize stalks," one boy said. "They're not even sweet yet. I'm sure they became sick." "I'll see you gents later," said another. "I'm not coming back tomorrow. I don't think I can manage the walk anymore." I suppose none of this really mattered, because on the first day of February, W.N. Fury made this announcement at Assembly. "We're all aware of the problems across the country, which we also face," he said, "but many of you still haven't paid your school fees for this term. Starting tomorrow, the grace period is over." My stomach tied itself into another knot because I knew my father hadn't paid my fees. I'd refused to ask him about it these past weeks, knowing what he'd say. The fees were 1,200 kwacha, and that was collected 3 times a year. Walking home, I cursed myself for being so optimistic, for allowing myself to become so excited. I wondered why my parents had even allowed me to go to the school in the first place. "What am I going to do?" I asked Gilbert. "I suppose I'm going home now to face the music." "Don't stress too much, he said. "Just wait and see what happens." When I got home, I found my father in the fields. "At school, they're saying I should bring my fees tomorrow. 1,200 kwacha, I said, so we should pay them. Mr. Fury wasn't joking around." My father looked down at the dirt the same way he'd looked at those sacks of grain in the storage room, as if waiting for it to tell him something. He then gave me the look I'd grown to fear. "You know our problems here, son," he said. "We have nothing." I was watching his lips move, but in my head I heard Mr. Fury's voice repeating what he'd said as we walked out of the school. "No fees, no school." "I'm sorry," said my father. "Next year will be better. Please don't worry." I could see that my father felt terrible, but I was certain it was nothing compared to how sad I felt. The next morning, perhaps just to torture myself, I woke up at the same time, stood at the junction, and waited for Gilbert. I even wore my black trousers and white shirt, though I didn't know why. I wasn't going anyplace. Soon Gilbert appeared and walked past. "Come on, William," he said. "Aren't you coming to school?" I wanted to cry, but didn't. "I'm dropping out," I said. "They don't have the fees." "Oh, sorry," he said. Gilbert looked quite upset, which somehow made me feel better. "Perhaps your parents can find the money." "Perhaps," I said. "I'll see you later, Gilbert." Feeling terrible, I walked over to Jeffrey's house to share my burden. A few weeks before, Jeffrey had a nice stroke of luck. During a big storm one night, a bolt of lightning had struck a giant blue gum behind his house and caused it to fall. The next morning, Jeffrey was outside hacking it apart with his panga. He wandered the roads selling clumps of firewood for 30 kwacha apiece, which had allowed his family to eat for a couple of weeks. Between my school and his firewood, I hadn't seen him much. I was anxious to catch up. Jeffrey was getting dressed when I walked in, and the very sight of him caused me to stop in place. His clothes looked borrowed, as if they belonged to someone else. His eye sockets were sunken and dark. The whites of his eyes appeared very white, as if he were a ghost or a spirit. My cousin had once been a big guy, a real bouncer, but now he was down to nothing. It had happened so fast. "Why aren't you in school?" he asked. "Didn't you get selected for Kachkolo?" "No money," I said. "Today I dropped." "Oh, sorry to hear. Me and you, we're in the same hopeless situation." "For sure." He stared down at the floor and shook his head. "Hopefully God has a plan for us." Even after seeing Jeffrey's condition and leaving his house, I still sulked around feeling sorry for myself, thinking, "Hey, why me?" As if I was the only one stricken with such luck. But that afternoon, when school let out, Gilbert stopped by again and told me the news. "Today we were few," he said. "Most of school dropped out as well. Out of 70 students, only 20 remained." My own problems didn't seem so important. The hunger belonged to the entire country. I decided to put faith in my father's word that once we made it through the hunger, everything would be okay. But first, we had to make it through the hunger. And as Jeffrey had said, it was hard enough just worrying about tomorrow. By late January, the gaga was finally gone. The people who depended on this for sema turned instead to pumpkin leaves, and here the real starvation began. Famine arrived in Malawi. It fell upon us like the great plagues of Egypt I'd read about, swiftly and without rest. As if overnight, people's bodies began changing into horrible shapes. They were now scattered across the land by the thousands, scavenging the soil like animals. Far from home and away from their families, they began to die. The same people I'd seen carrying their belongings to the trading center now stumbled past us in a daze, their eyes swimming in their sockets. The hunger ravaged the body in 2 different ways. Some people wasted away until they looked like walking skeletons. Their necks became long and thin, like a dacowi birds that drank near the river, not even strong enough to hold up their heads. Others were stricken with kwashiorkor, a dreadful condition a body gets when there are no proteins in the blood. Even as these people starved, their bellies, feet, and faces swelled with fluid, like ticks filling with blood. The starving people didn't say much as they passed. It was as if they were already dead, yet still looking to fill their stomachs. They moved carefully along the roads and through the fields, picking up banana peels and discarded cobs and stuffing them into their mouths. Near my house, groups of men were digging up the chikawo roots of banana trees so they could boil them like cassava. Some dug up other roots and tubers, even the grass from the roadside, and milled them into flour. Others resorted to eating the seeds from government starter packs, scrubbing off the pink and green insecticides that kept off the weevils. But it was impossible to get all the poison off, and many suffered from vomiting and diarrhea, which only made them weaker. Plus, having now eaten their seeds, they had nothing left to plant. Every day, the starving people stopped by our house and begged my father for help. I'd see them coming from far away and think, "Oh, this chap is looking fat." Finally, someone who's doing well, but once they arrived, I realized it was only the swelling. The starving people we saw had iron sheets on the roof of one building and thought we were wealthy, even though our sheets were only fastened by stones. Some of the men had walked 20 and 30 miles. "If you have one biscuit, please, I can work," they'd say, their bare feet too swollen to wear sandals. "We're now 6 days without eating. If you have just a small plate of sema." "I have nothing," my father had to say. "I'm barely feeding my family on just one walkman." "Just give us porridge," they demanded. I said no. A few men still chose to stay in our yard all night. The ground and wood were too wet for fires. When the rains came in the darkness, the men curled up under our porch and shivered. By morning, they were gone. A few nights later, we were seated outside having our meal when a man approached from the road. He was covered in mud and so thin it was hard to understand how he was even alive. His teeth poked out of his mouth and his hair was falling out. Without saying hello, he simply sat down beside us. Then, to my horror, he reached his dirty hands into our blob of sema and ripped off a giant piece. All of us sat there in shock, saying nothing as he closed his eyes and chewed. He swallowed long and satisfyingly. When the food was safely in his stomach, he turned to my father. "Do you have more?" "I'm sorry," my father said. "Okay then," the man answered, then stood up and walked away. The crowds continued to pour in from the bush. More than ever, they now converged at the trading center like herds of crazed and wasting animals driven together by fire. Women with thin, ashen faces sat alone, pleading with God. But they did it quietly and without tears. Everywhere the anguish was silent because no one had the energy to cry. Elsewhere in the trading center, children with swollen stomachs and strange copper hair clustered under storefronts. A few traders still spread tarps in the mud and sold grain, but the units had become smaller and smaller. Its price was like gold, like buying the universe and stars in 1/2 kilo. Crowds gathered round, but mostly to stare in stunned silence, as if watching a dream in heaven. Those with energy still screamed and begged. "Buona, just a small plate of flour," they said. "That's all I need. It's for my child." "If I start with you, then," the traders answered, and then nothing at all. Those with energy still stayed close, lunging like dogs whenever a kernel fell to the ground, scooping gravel and all into their mouths. One man weaved through the crowd, mumbling, "Please help. I'm an orphan. My father has died." The man was 40 years old. Each group told a different story of the dead. "I heard there was a man who'd spent days looking for food," one farmer said. "One morning he decided to nap under a tree and never woke up." "I was cooking wokwan," said another, when a man sat down uninvited, telling me, "I need to eat this." But before the sema was even ready, that man was dead. Others had gone so many days without eating, the first bellyful of food had sent their bodies into fatal shock. One woman stepped over 2 dead men on the road, still clutching their hose. Men who'd swelled with kwashiorkor tried to relieve their suffering by draining their great blisters with a knife, only to die several days later from infection. News came of Benny, the madman of Wimbe, who'd always made us laugh in better times. He'd run up to merchants in the trading center with his raving eyes and snatch cakes and Fantas from their stalls. No one ever took them away because his hands were always so filthy. The mad people had always depended on others to care for them, but now there were none. Benny died at the church. Amid this great suffering and confusion, the government radio said the president had traveled to London on state business. When he returned, a Malawian radio reporter questioned him about the famine. We all gathered around at home to listen. The reporter said something like, "Your Excellency, many are dying across the country from lack of food. What are you planning to do?" The president scoffed at this absurd idea, saying he'd grown up himself in the village where people often died of other things such as tuberculosis, cholera, malaria, or diarrhea, but never from a lack of food. "Nobody has died of hunger," he said. When the report was over, my father shook his head and turned away. "How could he say such a thing, Papa?" I asked. "Some men are blind," my father replied, "but this one just chooses not to see." That afternoon, the ways of the world suddenly became more clear. Whereas I was still confused as to how the hunger had been allowed to happen, this much was certain. Every man for himself. We were on our own.